John Fulton Reynolds was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1820 and attended schools in both Pennsylvania and Maryland before being appointed to West Point in 1837 and graduated in 1841. He also had three brothers who had significant military careers. After his time at the Point, he was assigned to the artillery, first at Fort McHenry and later at forts in South Carolina, Florida, and Texas at the outset of the Mexican War. He was brevetted twice in that conflict for gallantry at Monterey and Buena Vista. In the late 1850s, he served in the Utah Mormon expedition and was commandant of West Point between 1860 and 1861. It was around this time that he met his future fiancée, Catherine Hewitt of New York. Once the Civil War began, he was put in command of a brigade of the Pennsylvania Reserves. At Gaines Mills in the 7 Days Campaign, he was captured, but soon exchanged. In late August 1862, he performed valiantly as a division commander at 2nd Manassas, and before Fredericksburg in December 1862, was placed in command of the 1st Corps. After the Union disaster at Chancellorsville, he was likely privately offered command of the entire Army of the Potomac, but turned it down because of his perception of political interference from Washington in the running of the Army. Instead, President Lincoln orders one of his best friends, George Meade, to take command. Within 3 days, both men would fulfill their destinies at Gettysburg. Reynolds had now been appointed by Meade as a wing commander, so that in approaching south central Pennsylvania from northern Maryland, he is in charge of 3 Union Corps, the 11th, the 3rd, and his own 1st Corps. As elements of the Confederate Army attempt to get to Gettysburg from the west along the Chambersburg Road, Brigadier General John Buford's cavalry fight dismounted along ridge lines, trying to slow down their progress. Reynolds leads elements of his 1st Corps into a swale between the Lutheran Theological Seminary and the Herbst Woods, shouting to the 2nd Wisconsin Infantry, "For God's sakes, forward," and is almost immediately shot in the head and killed, likely by an overshot from a Tennessee rifleman. On the Union side at Gettysburg, it is Reynolds and Buford who select the battlefield and who are owed that part of the credit for the Union victory. Catherine Hewitt would arrive at his parents' home in Philadelphia on July 3rd and would stay next to his coffin all night. It was the first time his family had met her. She and John had kept their engagement secret because of differing religious backgrounds. She a Catholic, he a Protestant. Catherine Hewitt would never marry and would later join the Sisters of Charity Convent in Emmitsburg, Maryland, only 10 miles south of where her intended met his fate. Hello once again, and welcome to Pennsylvania in the Civil War. Today we are going to be interviewing General John Reynolds, who was born and now resides in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I'm going to be helped in my questioning by Brother Ed Shee of our History Department. General Reynolds, I believe I have the first question. I live in Lancaster County myself now, but I'm wondering what it was like in the 1820s and 1830s in terms of your being brought up in that period.
I think I was very fortunate to be born and raised in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. It was a bustling town of commerce and agriculture. My father was one of the leading citizens, a newspaper owner and editor, and the home that I grew up in was a beehive of activity with the presses on the first floor thumping constantly and men coming in and out with copy and debating the politics of the day and just the things that I learned in that newspaper office when I was a young lad. And of course, outside, many stores to go to look through, and of course outside the town with fishing on the Conestoga, hunting rabbits and such outside the town. It was just a very good place to grow up in.
General, why were you and your brother so heavily oriented towards a military career?
Well, it probably goes back to the fact that my grandfather, William Reynolds, and my other grandfather, Samuel Moore, were both soldiers in the Continental Army. And my father instilled upon us the great gift that the founding fathers and the soldiers of the Revolution handed to us, our freedom and our country. And also, above the mantel in the fireplace, there was a very predominant portrait of George Washington, and our father always took time to tell us the stories of a great man of George Washington and his military successes that brought about the country's freedom. So that, and also one of my earliest memories is of a 6-year-old child watching my father marching in a grand parade as a captain of the local militia, and he was a part of a large military contingent that was marching beside the very ornamental wagon that was contained the Marquis de Lafayette, who was visiting Lancaster in 1826. And I was quite taken not only by the martial display, but also by the uniforms and everything, the stories my father told me of the past of our country and of my family. So it's always been instilled upon us since we were young children.
Could you share with us some of your recollections of the Mexican War, the 1840s?
Well, I went into Mexico a very young, naive man, a young gentleman, I should say, serving, going to the point, reading about those grand campaigns of Napoleon in Europe, and serving in different places up and down the East Coast, and being very bored with that. I was looking forward to a chance to actually show that I could be a soldier and an officer in battle. And when I arrived in Mexico, I was full of the excitement. But after being involved in the siege of Fort Texas and the Battle of Monterey, and of course the very difficult Battle of Buena Vista in February of 1847, and seeing those battlefields and those horrific casualties on both sides, I think that it took a little bit of that excitement away from me. I learned to be a soldier, I learned to respect my career, but I didn't have the naive excitement about the career I had chosen. I know that I came out of the Mexican War a lot different than I went in.
Interested in knowing if you met any individuals or knew individuals during the Mexican War who would then go on to significant military careers.
Well, of course, I mean, I was very fortunate to meet a lot of men who would go on to significant careers, one of those being Zachary Taylor. Also was around the man who I thought was the most magnificent soldier of our time, and that was Winfield Scott. I remember when he came to the point in his uniform of a general, I was very taken by what a magnificent man he was. And also the men that I served with, anyone from George Thomas to Abner Doubleday to Daniel Harvey Hill, all these men were fine soldiers, and they were comrades in arms in Mexico. And it's very unfortunate that some of those men who I was acquainted with and I shared hardtack with and dirty water lined up now I'm fighting against. So, but I was very fortunate to know a lot of men who are significant soldiers.
More of a personal level, you met and were engaged to Catherine Hewitt. Could you tell us a bit about that relationship and how things would have happened?
Yes, that is more on a personal level, sir. Well, I won't tell the story completely. It's a long story, but as a young bachelor traveling from California in 1860, when I received an appointment to the Commandant of Cadets at West Point, I boarded ship in California, went down to the Panama Isthmus, crossed the Isthmus, and up to New York City. And during that trip, I met a young lady named Catherine Mary Hewitt, and we became quite good friends. And when we arrived in New York City, of course, I went up to the Hudson River to the academy, and she went to Philadelphia. And we corresponded for a number of months and grew quite close during that time. And when I was eventually appointed to go to Washington, D.C. after the firing of Fort Sumter, I stopped in Philadelphia to visit family, and then made my way to visit her, and at that time proposed marriage. We decided to wait after this terrible conflict was over and then tour Europe together. And unfortunately, we didn't have the opportunity to see through those plans.
Could you speak a little bit about your relationship with Fighting Joe Hooker, at one time commander of the Army of the Potomac during the Battle of Chancellorsville?
Well, I knew Joe Hooker. Everyone knew Joe Hooker, and we all knew his good points and bad points. One thing that I was impressed with Joe Hooker when he became commander of the Army of the Potomac was that he acted like McClellan. He took a bruised and battered army that had fought through Fredericksburg and that terrible march that we had in January of 1863, and the morale was low, and he was able to rebuild that army, rebuild its morale, bring in food, bring in uniforms, equipment, and this army, when Hooker's campaign started in April of 1863, I wrote home and said, this will be the final campaign of the war. We were over 100,000 strong, and our morale was high, and we were in great shape. And I was very disappointed that down along the Rappahannock and the Rapidan that something happened to Joe Hooker, and he took that magnificent army and led it to defeat. I knew him. He had assured me that I would have a major role to play in the campaign that wound up around Chancellorsville, but unfortunately he didn't see that promise through. I remember in my official report of my 18,000-man corps at Chancellorsville, I was able to report that I had 250 casualties. I never got into the battle. So Hooker's campaign began so gloriously and ended so terribly as I was greatly disappointed in Joe Hooker. Greatly disappointed.
I imagine as a person who was born in Lancaster and represented the state of Pennsylvania as well as you did, that getting the command of the Pennsylvania Reserves must have been quite an honor at one point in time in your career. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience that you had with the Reserves?
Well, getting any command was gratifying. I was commanding a division of, at that time, about 6,000 men. I had never commanded as much as a company, so to now all of a sudden wear a brigadier star and command a division was quite thrilling. They were seasoned troops. They had fought through the Peninsula Campaign. Our commander, George McCall, had gone home and would ask to be relieved. So I was given this battle-hardened division, and I was able to lead it to Manassas and a fight in that what's now termed, I believe, the Second Battle of Manassas in August of 1862, and they performed very well. And I was quite proud of what they had done, and quite proud of what George McCall, myself, George Meade, and Edward Ord had built out of these citizen soldiers who didn't understand what it was to be a soldier, didn't understand the need for discipline. And we made them into very, very good troops. So much so that when we arrived down on the peninsula, McClellan's army, I was approached by an English correspondent who asked me what regular troops these were, and that was a great compliment. So I was very proud to command the Pennsylvania Reserves.
Could you speak a little bit about your relationship with Pennsylvania's contribution to the presidency, James Buchanan?
Well, that's a great question. Of course, my entire career is because of James Buchanan and that relationship. I can remember James Buchanan, who was a very close friend of my father's, coming to our home in Lancaster, and we would gather around and say, Uncle Buckwheat is here. I had great affection for him, and he for us. I also think that he was courting my Aunt Lydia at one time. So I have great respect for James Buchanan, President Buchanan. Did I disagree with the way he handled the crisis at the end of his administration? Of course I did, but that will never break the bonds of affection I have for Uncle Buckwheat.
What was it like being held captive by the Confederates and your experience in Libby prison?
Well, I can tell you it wasn't very pleasant, sir, of course. It started out, I was greatly mortified by my position of being a captive, and the first one I met was Daniel Harvey Hill. And he asked me what was the matter, which I thought was a silly question, but I told him, of course, I'm mortified of being captured. And he said to me, John, everyone knows you're a good soldier and no one will think the worst of you. And he handed me the contents of his purse and put me on his personal wagon and sent me back to Richmond, where I was kept at the Spotswood Hotel for the first 6 days of my captivity. And I'd like to tell the story that they actually had the nerve to bill me $44 for my stay there. I would later be, and I point this out, I would later be marched through the streets of Richmond to what is now known as Libby Prison. And when I arrived there, my captor, the man who was in charge of Libby Prison, was an old cadet of mine, a man named Thomas Turner, who would not take the oath of allegiance after the firing of Fort Sumter. And he and I had many heated arguments before he left the point. And I guess he decided to, now that he was over me, he was going to take it out on me. And he made my stay there even more difficult. So It was not a pleasant situation, and quite frankly, I think I was a more difficult adversary after my treatment in Richmond in the summer of '62.
Some believe, I think your sisters and some of your family do, perhaps because of some letters that you sent them, that you were offered command or felt that about the command of the Army of the Potomac probably in the summer of 1863. Could you fill us in as to some of the actual details of that? And in hindsight, from a military perspective, might a different decision have been made?
Well, I must admit that I'm greatly embarrassed that that story is out because I cannot tell you how much respect I have for the commander of the Army of the Potomac, George Meade. But I had heard that I was being considered as a replacement for Joe Hooker, which was a surprise because I was not the ranking Major General in the Army of the Potomac at that time. I was outranked by Slocum and Sedgwick. And I was very concerned that this command was going to be thrust upon me. And that command, I felt, was a political command, and it ruined careers of very good soldiers. So I traveled to Washington, was able to gain an entrance into the to the president's mansion, and there we had a very frank discussion about what happened in the Chancellorsville campaign, what my opinion was of Joe Hooker and his continuing to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac, and I was very frank with what I thought our problems were. And President Lincoln said to me that while I'm not apt to relieve Joe Hooker at this time, if I did, General, would you take that command? Well, I felt that the question being posed that way, I certainly was able to tell him that while I was honored, here were some of my conditions on taking the command. I was not about to sacrifice my career on that altar of politics. I wanted to be able to command that army in the field without being badgered by telegraphs and direction from Washington, from Stanton and Halleck. And I wasn't sure if I should say it, but I spoke up very frankly in that regards. And President Lincoln said he could not guarantee this to me. So when I left, I wasn't sure if I had advanced my case for the command or ruined my career. Of course, we know a few weeks later, George Gordon Meade is made the commander of the Army of the Potomac. And quite frankly, I was pleased with that. I consider George Meade a fine soldier and a man who will lead it to victory.
On another point, what was your reaction to being called the Army's best horseman? And were there others who you felt were just as competent in that particular area?
Well, I wasn't aware that I was called the best or the Army's best horseman. I rode since I was a young boy. I remember on a bet at one time, I rode through the camp and picked a coin off the ground at full gallop, and maybe that's where I get that reputation. I enjoyed riding. I took to it at the point when they taught it there, and there were others who kind of plodded along. I think George Meade kind of plodded along occasionally, but I enjoyed good horse flesh and fine horses with a lot of energy, and so if I'm considered one of the best horsemen, then that's a great compliment, and I appreciate that.
We're in the process of interviewing General Winfield Scott Hancock and also General Meade for this series on Pennsylvania and the Civil War. And I'd like you to tell us some of the things that you discovered about them and some of your history with them and how you would describe them as generals and as men.
Well, in regards to Hancock, I believe he came to the point in my last year, so I'm not readily acquainted with him at that point. I remember seeing him in California before the war, but when I came to the Army of the Potomac, he had cemented his reputation in the early part of that campaign of McClellan's at the colonial capital of Virginia, I'm told, at Williamsburg. And I'm told he's a fine soldier and he handles brigades well, and now he's a division commander and he's a fine soldier. George Meade, I remember him as, I believe he was on the staff of Zachary Taylor in Mexico, even though he was an engineer and I was just a lowly lieutenant in the artillery, so we didn't have much time together. But we became reacquainted when we took our brigades and started to mold those reserve brigades into soldiers. And I had high regard for him. If I can pick one man who I consider my friend, I think George Meade would be that man. I do believe that we probably were both very difficult characters to get along with, and maybe that's why we actually were so closely associated and enjoyed each other's company. So both of them are fine soldiers, and I would serve with them and have them guard my flanks at any battle.
Let me just as a follow-up. Did the fact that you were from Pennsylvania, create any kind of, stronger relationship between you, or was that really unimportant since you were, in effect, U.S. regulars?
Yeah, I think that the Pennsylvania connection is while I enjoy that, I don't think it's that important. I do enjoy the fact that West Pointers and regulars, as you said, are in command positions where they should be and not these political appointees. So my regard for them is added to by them being fellow Pennsylvanians.
Could you give some insight as to why you and General Buford, the Union cavalry commander, believed that Gettysburg was the right place for the Union Army to battle Lee's Army of Northern Virginia?
Well, I think in some respects it's a spot on the map. I wanted to bring Lee's army to battle as soon as possible. That was a very good strategic position, Gettysburg. And the evening before July 1st, in receiving one of the many dispatches from General Meade, he mentioned, and I don't know if I can do it verbatim, but I remember it saying something like, "Wherever the enemy shows the greatest force, I must concentrate my army." And when I rode into Gettysburg on July 1st, it was apparent after Buford's report, and he had done a fine job, that Lee was concentrating in the Cashtown-Gettysburg area. And it seemed apparent to me that in picking Gettysburg and bringing up the corps of my wing, I was doing what George Meade wanted me to do. So Gettysburg was an important point on the map when it came to the road system, but I would have fought Lee in Cashtown, in Harrisburg, in Chambersburg, wherever I could have found him.
Was it your actual strategy, because General Doubleday wound up taking over command of the First Corps? Was it your actual strategy to fight a defense in depth, essentially, to hold the high ground south and east of the town of Gettysburg, or did you give that any real attention? It was just a question of fighting Lee where he was, or was the tactical position, the strategic position of Gettysburg at all important?
Well, I think the position was important. I do think that what Buford had done in the morning needed to be reinforced. There was an opportunity, as we know, and we look on the maps now, we know that Lee's army was greatly dispersed. Two corps coming from the Chambersburg, Cashtown area, one coming from the Carlisle-Harrisburg area, and of course a division coming from York. So there was an opportunity to thrust the Army of the Potomac in the midst of that and maybe isolate a section of that army and destroy it in detail and bring Lee to his knees. My intent was to feed as much as that wing into that position and hold the town if I could. But in my dispatch, verbal dispatch, I should say, back to me by Ryder was that if I'm driven into town, I will fight them inch by inch, barricading the streets and holding out as long as possible. I was going to inflict as much damage on the Army of Northern Virginia as I could if I had to give up those western and northern ridges beyond Gettysburg. But if I could hold them, I would do that also.
The state of Pennsylvania has put up several statues of you. There are three of them at Gettysburg. And there's also one outside of City Hall in Philadelphia that I assume bear testament to how the people of the late 19th century, particularly in Pennsylvania, felt about you. What's your reaction to that accolade?
Well, I'm quite honored, of course. I do consider myself a soldier doing his duty. I swore to protect the Constitution of the United States, and I was doing what I had swore in the Bible to do. So the fact that the state of Pennsylvania has honored me with statues for doing my duty, I'm greatly gratified by it. But in thinking about it, I would trade them all in if this terrible war wouldn't have happened, for sure.
Other than General Lee, who did you admire most as a competent opponent during the war?
Good question. Well, you take the premise that I admired General Lee greatly, okay. And I admire him as a gentleman. I admire him as a soldier. I do believe that this attitude that he is the soldier during this war is a little overrated, quite frankly. He's a man. He's made mistakes. While I was not at Malvern Hill, I heard that was a ridiculous charge, quite frankly, and many of his men were killed. I don't understand that. And of course, I was not at Antietam, but of course he dug his heels in when he was greatly outnumbered, and unfortunately McClellan didn't attack with his force, we could have destroyed the Army of Northern Virginia. So I think he made some tactical mistakes. During the war, I must admit that these men I came through the point with. So to say that I admired a lot of them as in the Confederate side, if I had to pick one, probably Albert Sidney Johnston. I served with him in the Mormon campaign. I thought he was a fine soldier, and I was sorry to see that he lost his life in Tennessee. So if I had to pick one, probably Albert Sidney Johnston.
Also on the Confederate side, although your corps didn't face him at Gettysburg, there's also a fairly controversial general at Gettysburg on the Confederate side by the name of James Longstreet. Did you have any acquaintance with him in
Mexico?
In Mexico?
Yes.
What were your thoughts about General Longstreet?
Well, he was a good soldier. I mean, he's a man who understood how to command men, and I would fight with him any day against an enemy. I think that he's a fine soldier, and I have high regard for him as a friend, as a comrade, and as a man who unfortunately made a decision to go into the Southern Confederacy, which I thought was unfortunate.
You mentioned the Mormon War. Could you say a little bit more about that? Because most people don't know much about the Army involvement.
Well, of course it wasn't a war.
Right.
But we did send federal troops out to bring the administration, shall we call it, of Brigham Young into line. They threw out the federal judges and decided that they were not subject to federal authority, at least as far as I knew.
Was this around 1857?
Yes, yes. Of course, that was not going to happen. The federal authority was going to be exercised in Salt Lake City, and federal troops were sent out. The initial command went out and was basically lay siege to, in some respects, at Fort Bridger because the Mormons had burnt the grasses around.
General Reynolds, I'd like to hear more about it. I'm afraid that the time is such that we have to close. So I'd like to thank you for this interview. Brother Ed Sheehy. Tune in next time for another episode of Pennsylvania Civil War.